Just a moment for the live stream. Okay, should be ready.
Okay, well, we are reconvening the Finance Committee meeting and not taking any action on the only miscellaneous item that we had on our agenda. So we'll move on now to the part 2 of the 2024 budget kickoff presentation and discussion. Bill.
Yeah, thank you. Bring that up. Okay. Yeah, we're going to continue part 2 of the budget kickoff presentation. Previously, we had talked about the overview of the city's budget structure and some context to the environment that we're in. Tonight, going to get into specifically provisions that are in the state budget, highlighting some of the anticipated issues for the 2024 budget, talk about the process and schedule. If you have any questions as we go, please let me know, and I'll try to leave some time for questions or any direction from the committee at the end as well. So looking at the state budget, primarily going to be going through provisions that were in an act that was recently adopted that include municipal funding provisions. That's 2023 Wisconsin Act 12, originally was Assembly Bill 245. That was passed as separate legislation, and then the funding for this act was included in the state budget that has now been approved and as of today signed by Governor Evers. Some of the key provisions that are in that act, shared revenue, additional funding for supplemental municipal aid. That additional aid comes with some maintenance of effort provisions in several areas, primarily public safety, has an innovation grant program, repeal the personal property tax, levy limit adjustments for TIF districts, restrictions on advisory referenda, and then several other provisions, including several provisions that apply to the city and county of Milwaukee. Looking specifically at those items that affect city of Middleton, I'll start with the big one, which is the additional supplemental municipal aid. So in our current budget, under current law, Middleton will receive $229,000 in municipal aid, also known as shared revenue, and that represents about 1% of our general fund budget for 2023. That shared revenue was originally based on a formula that took into consideration factors like population and equalized value of the community. But that original formula was suspended almost 20 years ago. And ever since then, it's just been municipalities get what they received in the previous year, with the exception of some years where they cut funding for the program and applied across the board cuts. So basically our funding for shared revenue has been flat or declining for the past 20 years. So this is a significant change in shared revenue, additional state funding that's being provided, funded by 1% of the state sales tax. And Middleton, in percentage terms, does very well in that we'll be receiving an additional just under $542,000 in that supplemental aid, which will bring our shared revenue payment from $229,000 to $770,990. That additional aid will begin in 2024, so we include that in our 2024 budget. And then in future years, that municipal aid payment will be tied to the increase in the state sales tax. So as state sales tax collections fluctuate, that will affect the amount of aid to be distributed. In most years, that has increased. There are only a couple of years in recent history where that's declined slightly, tied to major recessions. But it is a funding source that will grow and hopefully allow that municipal aid to grow over time. With that supplemental municipal aid, there are restrictions in how it can be used. So unlike our current base shared revenue allocation that can be used for any public purpose, the supplemental municipal aid, it can only be used for certain items that are listed as allowable in the act. And that's primarily public safety, specifically law enforcement, fire protection, EMS, emergency response communications, or our dispatch center, public works, courts, and transportation. Specifically called out in the bill is a prohibition against using any of the additional aid for administrative services. Also, some restrictions that come along with the additional funding is there are maintenance of effort provisions related to public safety. So for in law enforcement, you have to maintain at least one of the following: the tax levy for law enforcement, so the total amount of taxes we're collecting to be used for law enforcement, the percentage of our tax levy that's used for law enforcement, or the number of full-time equivalent locally funded law enforcement officers. For fire protection and EMS, it's 2 of the 4, which relate to expenditures for fire and EMS staffing, level of training and licensure, and response times. And at least from an initial look at this, I don't anticipate the maintenance of effort provisions being a challenge for us to meet as a growing community. I think it's primarily to prevent communities from reducing or laying off staff within these areas, but for a growing community that's likely to be at least maintaining or increasing funding over time, likely not to be a major constraint on our budget, at least in the short term. So in addition to the shared revenue and the supplemental aid payments, there's also an innovation grant program that's providing $300 million statewide for these 3-year innovation grant programs. There's still a lot of questions about how this is going to work in practice, and the Department of Revenue is going to be establishing rules and applications with more information to come. But it appears that this is generally intended to provide an incentive for municipalities to create savings by transferring or consolidating services with another municipality or with a nonprofit organization. In order to apply, you need to show at least a 10% reduction in expenditures, and the grants are tied to how much is the cost to provide the service. And there are limits of $10 million per municipality out of that $300 million statewide, with indications that priority will be given to public safety innovations that maintain appropriate service levels. So it's something to watch. There's a lot of information that's going to be coming, and we'll have to see what the rules are and if there are things that we can consider that may be eligible for grants under that program. Another major item included in the bill is the final repeal of personal property tax. There are some categories of personal property tax that are already exempt under Wisconsin law. Manufacturing tools and equipment is one of those, and machinery tools and equipment. All of the remaining personal property tax will be fully exempt beginning January 1 of 2024. So for our upcoming budget in 2024, we will still have one more year that we are sending out personal property tax bills. That'll be based on property that was valued January 1 of this year. We'll be sending bills in 2023 and collecting that in 2024. But then in future budgets, we will not be collecting personal property taxes. And in its place, the state has an aid program that's intended to make us whole. So based on what we collect for personal property taxes in 2024, we will get an aid payment starting in 2025 for that dollar amount. So it should make us whole on a dollar for dollar basis. The disadvantage is that we will not get additional funding. So whereas personal property values tend to grow over time as businesses invest more in personal property and we have expansion, we will get state aid based on what we got in 2024, and that will continue at that same level going forward unless some other legislative change is made in the future to add to that. And to put that in perspective, personal property taxes are about 3% of our total tax roll. So it's not a huge amount, but that will over time somewhat limit the potential growth of our tax revenue. There's also some changes in levy limits related to TIF districts that came out as part of this bill. And this is something where when this originally was proposed, it could have been much, much worse than what ended up getting included in the final bill. Under current law, and in the chart here, what I've labeled as prior law, when there's growth and development in a TIF district, that new construction counts towards the city's levy limit adjustment. And we need that in order to be able to provide services to property located in the TIF. There's also an adjustment when a TID closes or when you subtract territory and take it out of a TIF district based on 50% of that value. So when we did the subtraction from TID 3, we took a bunch of property out, we added to the non-TIF tax base that helps keep taxes lower. And we also were able to get a levy limit adjustment based on 50%, which helps us to provide services. Under the new law, they're going to change that so that instead of it being a 100% of net new construction each year, it'll be 90%, but it's 90% of new construction, not net new construction. So you don't have to subtract out if you have a redevelopment, you're not subtracting out the decrease in value from what was redeveloped. That should be somewhat of a wash in most cases. The bigger change comes for the closure or subtraction, which instead of being based on 50%, will be based on 10% of the value in the TID, with an exception that if you close a TID more than 75% early compared to its life, or I guess if the TIF goes less than 75% of its expected life, you can get that adjustment up to 25%. That only applies to new TIF districts created after 2024. So it's not an immediate issue. It doesn't affect the city's 2 active TIF districts right now, but in the future, it creates less of a benefit from municipalities to having large amounts in a TID and then closing that and getting the levy limit adjustment. So something we'll need to consider as we're planning new TIF districts within the city. As part of the additional funding, there are restrictions on local advisory referenda. Originally, there was going to be a complete prohibition on local advisory referenda. The final passage of the bill allows them in some limited cases, specifically capital expenditures proposed to be funded by property taxes, and then some items where state law references doing advisory referenda, such as for shared revenue agreements between municipalities, cooperative boundary agreements, and certain cable and telecommunications activities that would require that. And then outside of the advisory referenda, there are still referenda required and allowed for things like exceeding the property tax levy limit, as the city of Middleton did recently, or increasing certain fees without a levy limit adjustment. But the ability to just do an advisory referendum not tied to a project or funding is much more limited than it used to be. And then there are various other provisions and restrictions. I'm not going to go through the full list, providing this for reference. And there's also several things that affect Milwaukee that don't affect the city of Middleton, but a lot of restrictions that the state put in place with the additional funding. So turning to some of the specific 2024 budget issues that we're anticipating for Middleton, and this is not an exhaustive list, but just some of the initial items that we anticipate we'll need to discuss and make some decisions on. I'm going to start with some high-level revenue estimates and personnel costs, and then touch on TIF districts, ARPA funding, transportation, stormwater, and potential transportation utility exploration. So looking at revenue estimates, our largest source of revenue in the city's general fund is property taxes. That represents almost 2/3 of our revenue in the general fund. And the growth in property taxes is tied to our net new construction. This graph looks at the changes in net new construction over the past several years, and it's varied between about 1.5% and 3% with an average of about 2.3%. From the preliminary information we have from our city assessor, we are expecting that we are going to be down somewhat for the 2024 budget. And that is based on construction that took place in 2022, was valued in 23, and that's our limit for our 2024 budget. And it sounds like that is primarily just due to a timing issue. We have a lot of projects that are underway this year, but when we look at what was actually constructed and in the ground at the end of 2022, it was a little bit of a lighter year. So we're looking at an estimated 1.2%. And to put that in dollar terms, that would generate a levy increase of about $177,000. And that's compared to $320,000 the previous year. So we're expecting less of an increase in tax revenue. This next slide looks at that property tax levy limit and then our major state aid categories in the general fund. So property tax increase about $177,000 or 1.2%. Our base shared revenue and utility aid under shared revenue, we're expecting those to stay the same. The big area of increase is that supplemental additional municipal aid, the additional $542,000 roughly. We're expecting our expenditure restraint program aid to go down. Expenditure restraint is a voluntary state program, and if you limit the growth of your expenses within the general fund to below a certain amount, you get this additional aid payment. However, when they calculate the amount of the aid payment, it's based on your tax rate. And because our tax rate has been going down, the amount of aid we get under that program is projected to go down as well. Exempt computer aid and exempt personal property aid, these are for items that are already exempted, and those are flat dollar amounts. And then general transportation aid, there's additional 2% funding in that program in the state budget. We don't yet know what our piece is going to be. The overall pie available statewide is increasing by 2%, but there's a formula that looks at how much you're spending and the average over the last 6 years, and it compares that to other municipalities. And we'll get that information as we get farther into the process. So right now we're estimating a 2% increase. There's the potential that could be a little bit higher or a little lower. So adding just all of those sources together, we're looking at about a $665,000 increase, or about 3.9%. There will be other revenue changes. We'll be looking at room tax, ambulance revenue, all of our other revenue estimates as we get farther into the budget process. But just to get an idea of these big ones, that's what we're looking at. And that's certainly more than in a typical year, primarily because of the additional shared revenue. And I think the thing that's going to be important for us to consider is that this is going to be a 1-year jump in that shared revenue payment. And after that, it should increase as sales tax revenue increases, but the percentage increases will be much smaller. So this is kind of a one-time opportunity to get such a large increase in 1 year. And we'll have to think through what's the appropriate way to use that and build future budgets to be able to accommodate that. I want to touch on TIF districts and planning for TIF district number 3 closure, which is one of the items that's identified in the strategic plan. And as we get closer to the closure of TID 3, we need to continue to phase out what is called the cost recovery payment. Cost recovery are items that have been paid from TIF district number 3 to the city's general fund to help reimburse the general fund for services provided to the TIF district. And at its peak, that was about $1.8 million a year. And the city has recognized that when TIF 3 closes, and actually when we get to the end of the expenditure period, which is coming up in 2025, we can no longer make those payments from the TIF district. So over many years now, the city has been working to phase out that TIF cost recovery. It's down from the peak of 1.8 million to 625,000 in the 2023 budget. And we're proposing that we continue to step that down over the next 2 budgets, bringing that down to 0 in 2026 at the end of the expenditure period for TID 3. The item that we could consider looking at, and this will be fleshed out more as part of the budget, is whether we create an administrative charge that would go towards our other active TIF district number 5. And rather than trying to look at a wider gamut of services provided to properties in the TIF, just restricting this to purely administrative costs for the TIF district. And that would be things like the city administrator's time, my time, planning and development staff's time. So staff that are actively working and spend a portion of their time on managing projects within the TIF district, that is something that we could consider what are appropriate allocations and then charging those administrative costs to the TIF district. So it would be something that would be much more refined and specific than the cost recovery plan for TIF 3. And just for illustrative purposes, I've indicated how you could potentially step that up over 3 years to help with the phase out of the cost recovery from TIF 3 and establish a reasonable administrative charge for TIF 5. So more to come on that, certainly. Looking at the expenditure side for the general fund, as we are working on getting information out to departments to put their requests together, we are making some assumptions on personnel costs. For our police and EMS union employees, we have existing contracts for 2024. The police contract has a 3% cost of living adjustment plus steps. EMS contract has a 2.5% increase for 2024 plus steps. As we're starting the budget process for non-union employees, we're putting in an initial estimate of 2.5% for a cost of living adjustment. That will be reviewed and we'll make recommendations as we get farther in the budget process. Under the city's non-union compensation and classification plan, our wage increases should be tied to the employment cost index for state and local government. And that had spiked up in 2022. We're starting to see signs of that coming down. In about another month, we'll have the second quarter update. And then by the time we're into active budget discussions, we'll have the third quarter update from this year. So that could change, but 2.5% to 3% was an estimate provided by the HR manager as he was trying to plot where that employment cost index may end up by the time we finish our budget process. In addition to the cost of living adjustment for non-union staff that opted out of the longevity program, we would also have market adjustments based on the position in their range. And that can range from 0.25% up to 2%. So the higher percentage would be for someone that's at the beginning end of their salary range, and then that decreases as they progress through the range. Health insurance, we don't have any information on the renewal yet. We expect to get initial indications within the next month or so. Our previous increase was about 6%. For budgeting purposes, to try to be conservative, we've plugged in 8%. We're certainly hoping that it comes in lower than that. And dental insurance in recent years has been at a 0%. Again, to be conservative, we've plugged in 3%. There's the potential it could come in lower than that as well. And we do know that there are going to be some small increases in the Wisconsin Retirement Service system rates. So that's what we're using as initial estimates that'll be built into the department requests. But as we continue discussions into September and October, we will update all of these as more information becomes available. American Rescue Plan funds. As you all know, the city received about $2.1 million in American Rescue Plan Act funds. Those need to be fully obligated by the end of 2024 and fully paid out by 2026. So as we're entering the 2024 budget process, we're recommending that we review all of the remaining projects. And if there are projects that are not going to have money spent by the end of this year, that we make sure that those can be allocated to projects and fully obligated next year so we don't lose any of those funds. Currently, we have only about 28,000 that's unallocated, but there are also projects that we anticipate will not be completed this year. And so our recommendation is that we review all of those projects for being considered for carryover for next year, as well as the allocations for next year, and just make sure that all of those are projects we feel comfortable moving forward with next year. And again, just for reference, not going to go through all the lines on here, but this is our current status of what was actually spent in 2021 and 2022. What's been budgeted for 23, and then tentatively allocated for 2024. Another topic is the stormwater utility referendum. So Middleton created a stormwater utility in 2016. And at that time, the decision was made to limit the scope of the stormwater utility and establish a low annual fee of $15 per equivalent runoff unit. So a single family home is considered one equivalent runoff unit. So they'd be paying $15 per year under the original stormwater utility. Other properties would pay based on their impervious surface area compared to that standard ERU. In 2019, Middleton voters approved a referendum to increase that fee from $15 per ERU to $45 for a 5-year period to fund repairs related to the flooding that occurred in 2018. And we are coming up on the end of that 5-year period, and we'll have the first quarter of 2024, but then beginning with the second quarter bills going out mid-year next year, the fee would revert to $15 per ERU. So the city could consider potentially looking at a referendum in April of 2024 to potentially retain some or all of the current fee level if there's a desire to use additional revenue to pay for stormwater utility positions or additional projects to continue to maintain the city's stormwater infrastructure. And even at the higher fee level, Middleton still has a very low ERU compared to other communities in Dane County. And as the slide on the next page shows, this is based on information from 2022 from the Wisconsin chapter of the American Public Works Association. So of those communities in Dane County that have stormwater utility fees, the range is from Shorewood Hills at $110 per ERU to Middleton currently at the lowest at $45 per ERU. And then you can see where our base fee was at 15. So it's certainly something to consider. Many of our peer communities have higher stormwater utility fees that are using those fees for funding additional projects and staffing to maintain their stormwater assets. We've also talked somewhat about a transit special revenue fund. Currently, transit service is budgeted in the city's general fund, and we have an annual payment to Madison Metro under our agreement to provide transit services. And beginning in 2023, as you know, we made a change in our transit funding and applied directly to the state for transit aid rather than receiving a portion of the city of Madison's transit aid. And with that, we have a payment to Metro of about $1.1 million. This year, we're expecting to receive $820,000 in transit aid for a net local share of about $309,000. We did, at a previous action of the Finance Committee and Council, $100,000 was allocated for bus stop improvements. But even with that allocation, we are projecting a surplus in transit of $120,000. And that's due to the additional aid that we received by going to the state directly rather than getting an allocation from Madison Metro. So the concept's been discussed, and part of the budget process, there could be direction to create a transit special revenue fund, which would take transit out of the general fund. This projected surplus for this year could be the starting funds for that. And then the way that would operate in the future, if we go this direction, is we would have our annual payment to Metro. We'd have our state aid coming in. We'd have a portion that would be coming from the general fund and from general revenues to pay for our local share. But if there are any savings or additional state aid or balances like this, they would stay in that fund to be used for future transit costs and improvements. And then finally, on the 2024 issues, at the last presentation, we talked about several alternative funding options that are out there. There was an interest in learning more about transportation utilities. Transportation utility is a concept of establishing fees for paying for transportation improvements and maintenance based on average trip generation. And it's a potential alternative rather than using the property tax levy or using borrowing funded by taxes to pay for street maintenance and improvements based on users and how much they're contributing to traffic. Transportation utilities in Wisconsin do not have a specific enabling statute. They're also not prohibited by state law. So the municipalities that have established them have done so based on home rule authority. And it's been somewhat of a question about the legal status of transportation utilities, but there was some additional clarity earlier this year when there was a case in Waukesha County Circuit Court where Wisconsin Manufacturing and Commerce had challenged the Village of Pewaukee's transportation utility, and the Circuit Court ruling upheld the ability of the Village of Pewaukee to establish and maintain their transportation utility. So if this is something there's interested in, it would take some additional investigation. Our recommendations would be that we could do a separate presentation and discussion about transportation utilities, perhaps in August, September. And then if there is interest in exploring this, we could potentially look at funding a study in the 2024 budget to actually work with an engineering firm or financial consultants that could help look at what a transportation utility would look like for Middleton, should that be something we want to pursue in the future. And to give a sense of where these have been used, based on information that I have from earlier this year, these are the communities that either have an active transportation utility, those in the center that are either are in the process of developing or had looked at but placed on hold until some of the legal issues were decided, and then a few communities that had looked at them but ultimately decided not to go forward at this time. So it's a relatively small number of municipalities that currently have transportation utilities. It is one of the potential alternative funding options that are out there. And I think really gets to a policy question of, is there another way to fund transportation rather than primarily with property taxes based on value of the property? So from that, shifting to budget process and timeline. As part of looking at the budget, I'd recommend that we consider reviewing the city's budget ordinance 3.01. As I looked, the last amendment I could find was 1977. I'm not sure if it has been amended since then, but looking at the ordinance, there is no reference to the city administrator or finance director positions. The city clerk is in charge of running the whole budget process, so I guess Brian and I can get off easy. But I think it has not been looked at in recent years, and at a minimum, it should be updated to reflect current positions and the current timeline. As part of that review, we may also want to look at including a step in the process for the development of a proposed budget, which would be jointly put together by the mayor and administration. And as part of looking at trying to streamline our budget process, I think if we had the department requests and a proposed budget as a starting point, that would help make the time more efficient, both for the staff review as well as the finance committee's work, rather than having the budgets prepared, presenting all of the department requests, then having staff and the mayor work on developing scenarios, then presenting that, and then continuing the discussion. So something to consider. And then finally, I would recommend that we also consider looking at the authority for the city administrator to approve budget transfers between departments. That's currently $1,000, which seems very low. I'm not sure if or when that was ever amended. Not sure what the appropriate dollar amount is, but there's not much that falls under this category. Just trying to graphically lay out the budget process. Currently, departments prepare requests. We do an initial review with the mayor and administration. Then the departments present their requests and they're reviewed by the finance committee. Then we have budget scenarios presented. Finance committee reviews the scenarios, and then it goes to the council for amendment and then adoption. And I think that we can make the process a bit more efficient if we have departments prepare the request. We combine the initial review and development of our proposed budget scenario. Then the finance committee could review both the department requests and that proposal at the same time, make their recommendation, and then go to council for amendment and adoption. So something for consideration and maybe help streamlines our meetings and makes them a little bit more productive. As far as the timeline, we're finishing up the second budget kickoff meeting. We'll be sending out forms and instructions to departments within the next few days, and then asking for department requests back on August 18th. We'd be looking at scheduling probably a special finance committee budget work session sometime in mid to late September, additional sessions if needed, and then suggesting that we earmark some time at our regular finance committee meetings on October 3rd and 17th to continue those budget discussions and to finalize a recommendation public hearing notice. That would allow us to publish the public hearing notice on October 26th. We have to allow at least 15 days after publication before we hold a public hearing. So tentatively looking at November 15th for a possible public hearing and council budget meeting. And then that would allow us to potentially have council action on November 21st to adopt the budget, with the first meeting in December being available for any follow-up implementation items such as salary resolution, sewer rates, EMS fee schedules, and any other items needed to implement the budget. So again, I know that was a lot of information that I went through very quickly. If there are any questions or any comments or direction, would appreciate the feedback, and certainly am available to follow up if there are questions after the meeting at any point during the process as well.
Thank you, Bill. That was an excellent presentation. You hit all of the topics, and I can tell you I'm super excited about putting together the 2024 budget and hearing what the departments are going to be requesting. And I love the idea of amending our annual budget policy that has not been updated since 1977. That's shocking. Any questions for Bill at this time? We obviously will have many opportunities to ask Bill questions. I have no questions. I would just say I would like to have a presentation on transportation utilities. That was one of the best panel discussions I sat in on at the League of Wisconsin Municipalities meeting last year. And it was very, very interesting. And I also really look forward to revisiting our very low stormwater utility fee. And just out of curiosity, do we know if any of our peer utility or peer cities were as affected by flooding in 2018 as we were. Not drawing a correlation between their higher rates and our lower ones, but just curious.
I mean, City of Monona did have, not to the same level of extent, but damage that required FEMA payments similar to ours. Their fee was already higher than ours to begin with, so.
Okay, and how, I've asked this before, I'll ask it again. How do we get the ball rolling on making the decision to go to a referendum to ask the voters to allow us to continue that charge and maybe even increase it and use the funds for stormwater engineer?
Yeah, I think it would be as part of that package of resolutions that the council would adopt in adopting the budget itself. So towards, the end of November, that November 21st meeting, as an example, we would have a resolution that the council could consider. And if you were to adopt it, that would have the language for the referendum question in it. So that would start the process for the clerk and the city attorney to do the notifications necessary to have it on the ballot for April 24.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
I just had one question regarding the allowable uses under the supplemental municipal aid and the prohibition of administrative services. So under all these allowable uses, if we expand law enforcement, fire and EMS and public works and courts and transportation, you need more administrative staff, you need more people to support all these changes. Or under this, if you do an expansion under one of these allowable uses area, would that accommodate bringing on a staff person dedicated to those areas, to that area?
Yeah, and my understanding is that we can't use the additional supplemental aid directly for other administrative staff, but if we are having expenses go up in those areas, and even before you look at adding staff, we will have some increases just from cost of living adjustments and step increases, health insurance, all of that, that we can direct the additional aid towards that, plus any additional staffing in those areas, and then potentially use other revenues, such as the increase in property taxes under net new construction or other aid categories for increases in administrative staff. We'll see how the details come out from Department of Revenue, but as part of the discussions, there was recognition that municipalities, as long as they're maintaining their maintenance of effort and directing the new supplemental aid to those categories, that they will have increases in other areas of their budget that can be funded by other revenue sources.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Hearing none, I'll say again, thank you, Bill. We are at the end of our agenda. Would someone like to make a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion that we adjourn.
I'll second that. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we are adjourned. Thank you.